Peace, family. Good morning. We're on chapter 7 of Fostering False Identity, but welcome to African Esquire TV and We Charge Colonialism. We're going to be continuing in on a dissection of the child welfare system in the United States of America. And this video in particular, we're going to give a lot of focus on that system. So we're going to be going through the history. Why is it that Africans are overrepresented in the child welfare system? So before we get started with that, I do just want to say a few announcements. One announcement is that tomorrow at 12 p.m. To Eastern Time on Black Power Media. If you have not heard, we've been announcing that a coalition of Pan-Africanist organizations, Africa Unity Movement for Decolonization, will be releasing a declaration against the colonial powers. And it's pretty significant that it'll be tomorrow because tomorrow is also the 70th anniversary of We Charge Genocide. And we know We Charge Genocide was a monumental moment, particularly for changing and shifting the attitudes of many Africans in the United States away from domestic policies and domestic courts towards international law or fighting for human rights instead of civil rights. So in the tradition of those who have laid that foundation for us, we want to out the colonial system and do it collectively. So that will be tomorrow on Black Power Media at 12 p.m. In addition, you're going to start seeing transitions as far as this channel. Soon will be changed with the new year from African Esquire TV to We Charge Colonialism TV. Essentially the same things will be happening, except for we'll be bringing Frank on regularly. He'll be having a weekly show where he'll be talking about his revolutionary repatriation program, or our revolutionary repatriation program. And he'll be having a weekly show on that. In addition, we also have our podcast and book club, obviously on Saturdays. That will remain the same. And I will still have African Esquire TV, but it will be more so a segment instead of being the entire channel. So just watch out for those changes and don't be caught off guard if you see a video posted from me on We Charge Colonialism TV and you're wondering why is it a different name. So that is just a heads up to everyone. Hello, everyone. Going to say good morning. I'm just going to do my usual post for everyone to join in, and then we're going to get right started. I would be curious to know in the chat, as I said before, let's make sure that we share. Whenever we have a question, we actually use a question mark because that helps me to know that you're asking a question. But I would be curious to know as I go through this, what are your experiences in the child welfare system in the United States as parents, as African parents? I by no way think that I am one of the only people who have had family inside of the child welfare system. I know I'm not one of the only people who have directly seen the ills of the child welfare system. And so as I'm going through the laws, the systemic laws that have gone into creating this system, I'd be very curious to hear and see your feedback about your experiences as African parents. To be completely honest, when I wrote this book, the book Fostering False Identity, the child welfare system's design of social control for the Black family, I didn't write the book thinking that it was necessarily going to affect the people who are in control of the system, but more so because I feel like African parents, we have to have some backing as far as, like, we all know the system's racist, but we have to have a backing to be able to go to the system and say, no, we understand the history, we understand what you were doing when you created these laws, and therefore we're demanding a change. Otherwise, it's like we're fighting against all these white liberals who are pretending that they have this child welfare system to help us and because they care about our children. And I felt like we needed to have a direct argument that no, this system from its inception was created to do exactly what it's doing. That is to control African families, control Native American families, control any family that the system deems a threat to it. So because of that, we have to demand autonomy. And that's what we're going to get into next week. Next week will be our last day covering this because essentially that will be the last chapter. And so next week, we'll be talking about what are the solutions to this system and not so much focusing on the problems, but focusing on what sovereignty, autonomy, what does that mean whenever you're living inside of a white supremacist system. So with that, we're about to get started. And okay, so checking out the comments, seeing if everyone's doing well. Good morning, everyone. So we're about to get into this. We're going to start out by talking about more so the foundations of the system before we get right into the system. I want everyone to ask themselves a question, and then I'm going to drink some tea to get my voice ready. The question is, as I explained, prior to really the 1940s, 1930s area, prior to that time, the majority of African children were not in the child welfare system. In fact, almost no African children were in the child welfare system. As I said before, this system was literally created originally for the white children who were basically deemed other, and they wanted to bring them into whiteness. Because of that, anytime that a child was neglected, quote unquote, and neglect essentially means a child that's not being cared for. Anytime a child was in need, if there was a situation where there was an emergency, the African community in the United States would surround that child. So you would have people who would be willing to take that child in. Does not necessarily even have to be a relative, although many times it was a relative, sometimes a distant relative, sometimes someone that just identified themselves as kin with the child. They would take that child and they would basically do what the system says it's doing. They would protect that child and help that child be nurtured until that child was able to do so themselves. So this was the case prior to 1940s, 1930s era. How do you go from having almost no children, I would say at 1.0 African children in the child welfare system, to within a span of about 50 years, going into the 70s, of a majority of the children or a disproportionate amount of the children inside of foster care are African? How do you go from being none to being disproportionately representative inside of this system? That's what we're going to talk about today, because as we're going to see, it was a very tactical way that the system manipulated politics and manipulated policies in order to basically use this as the newest tool for social control. And the idea being, as we talked about last week, assimilation. So let me drink my tea and we'll get into this. So before we go into child welfare, let's go into what created the system. So if you don't know, at one time in American history, welfare, as we know it today, was not this big thing that people would use to shame poor people. It was actually something that was created to help white women. So there was really a fight to keep it just that. Welfare originally came out of the White House Conference on the Care of Dependent Children. So basically, the system noticed that a lot of white children were going into the foster care system, and they became concerned. Probably also a cost-benefit analysis, understanding that they were paying for these children going into the system, but also just the fact that you had a lot of children being separated from their white families. Well, the system thought to itself, well, maybe if we do something to basically help these white families, the children could stay with their families. And so they created what they called mother's pensions. So what we call welfare today originally was called mother's pensions. And that was essentially what was done across states. Out of the 50 states of the United States, 46 states had mother's pensions. These were basically, the state would pay a mom to stay home and take care of their child. They gave them cash payments, and this was done only to certain parents, not to all parents. And so they had these things called suitable home provisions. Many of us have probably heard of this. We've probably heard particularly of our families who were experiencing this back in the 80s and in the 70s and maybe even the 90s, something called man in a house laws. That was out of the suitable homes provisions. So they weren't going to just give any white woman a mother's pension. They were only going to give the ones that were deserving. They tried to more so give mother's pensions to women who were widows. So your husband just died. It's not because of you being poor or you being defunct. It's just because you needed money, so let's give you some money to take care of your children at home. But they really did not try to give it to single mothers, and they especially, regardless of what the circumstances were, tried their best to not give it to African mothers, because there were a lot of reasons that go into that. One of the reasons they tried to make sure that African women were not receiving these pensions was because we were a source of labor, particularly in agriculture and inside of different home roles, whether it was being a maid. You all have seen the help, right? Well, they seen that as a vital source of labor. Keep in mind, at the time, we were primarily the big racial group inside of America that was utilized for low-cost labor. So one, they saw that if we give these Africans money, then we won't have a source of labor. The other thing, though, was because they understood that in their mind, encouraging Africans to be able to take care of their children may lead to more children. And we've heard of many things inside of American history, for example, of forced sterilization. They have sterilized women, if you do not know that, particularly in prisons or in situations where they wanted to basically say you cannot have access to these funds unless you actually are sterilized. So there was also the social control element. They did not want to give money to these people because they felt like they would have more children, and instead they wanted to regulate us. So because of these things, the system did everything that they could to ensure that we were not going to get these mother's pensions. Now, this came to a head in 1935. The Social Security Act was created, and that included Title IV, or the Aid to Dependent Children. Now, essentially, this made this a federal program instead of a state program. But now that it's a federal program, as we talked about before, whenever you have a federal program, you have the issues of states' rights. You know, states still want to be able to do what they can to oppress us Africans. And so particularly in the South, you'll see a lot of states who get nervous whenever the federal government tries to take the predominant role. But fortunately for those states, there was still a lot of discretion as far as what rules they could create as far as who could have access to these mothers' pensions. One thing, though, that happened in the South was that they had more arbitrary laws to try to keep Africans away from these pensions. So we talked about the fact that there was man in a house rules. Essentially, if you had a male in your house, they would say, oh, you don't need welfare, or you don't need a mother's pension, so you're going to be left out. Also, you had to be of a certain middle class background. They would go into your home and do these home assessments. They would basically make sure that you were deserving of receiving this type of aid before they allowed you to have that aid. Well, it became more and more of a problem, particularly when it became a federal program, because you had more African women who were seeking help from the government because many of us were facing a lot of hardships. Keep in mind, this is around the time of the Great Depression. A lot of people tried to make welfare. We adopt the conservative narrative of welfare, which is very false. The conservative narrative of welfare was Black people we were doing great. We were independent. We were striving. We were going to make it to the top. And then the government came in and offered welfare, and then we became lazy. No, that's a lie. That's a lie from the mouth of the white supremacists that we should not be sharing among those in our community. The truth is that the entire nation was devastated during this time. Again, this is post the Great Depression. And not only was the entire nation devastated, the African community was especially devastated, as always happens whenever, white America has a cold. We basically have to have a whole operation because it knocks us completely down. So we have an issue of many people who are seeking assistance because they literally just can't survive. The market crashed, the country was in peril. So this is an issue, obviously, whenever you have all these African women applying for services. But what happened is that, as I said, states in the South, one of them particularly Louisiana, which basically Louisiana led to the law being changed. States in the South began to deny a bunch of women who were African receiving welfare benefits. Well, that caught the eye of the federal government. In particular, in Louisiana, they called, they rejected 14, this is actually Florida, 14,000 children who were rejected. They were considered illegitimate children, and that was another disqualifier inside of that particular state. So when Louisiana basically had all of these women trying to get assistance, they were denying a bunch of applications. So something happened inside of 1960. Louisiana had a population of 1/3 African, right? And they put out a rule that said no assistance will be granted to a child living with its mother if the mother has an illegitimate child after receiving assistance. Now, this might not sound like it was targeted towards African children, but it was targeted towards African children. That's something that we should understand, because these things would be done because they felt like that was a good way to deny us, saying you can't have an illegitimate child. Not saying all of us have children born out of marriage, but that was basically their way to allow these people who were going in and doing these assessments to discriminate against African mothers. And this led to just, like I said, a sharp decrease in Africans who were eligible for welfare inside of Louisiana. This caught the attention of the U.S. Secretary Arthur Fleming of Hugh in 1961. And essentially what he did, Supposedly, he was trying to do this out of fixing the problem. I don't know if that's true, because I'm going to talk about how shortly after that, you know, the problem got worse because the federal government, the same federal government, basically changed around the laws. But he basically did something where he said, if these homes are unsuitable, these Black homes are unsuitable, or any homes are unsuitable, well, if homes are unsuitable, you should be taking the children, because why would you leave a child inside of an unsuitable home? So therefore, if you call a home unsuitable, you have to take that child and put them into foster care. That was the rule that he put out. It's called the Fleming Rule. Well, the southern states in particular, and many other states, you know, said, okay, fine. If that's what you're saying, if that's how we keep Africans from, or Black people from accessing welfare, then fine, we'll just take the children and put them into foster care. And that's literally where our mass inception into the foster care system began. Almost instantly, 150,000 African children taken from their families and put into the foster care system. Now, 1962, this is the year after the Fleming Rule comes out, there are these public welfare amendments that grant funding to the states to implement social services. And this basically allows the states to have more capacity to take these children out of their homes. So that's why I said I don't know necessarily if it was him, Arthur Fleming, making this rule innocently, because right after he says this rule that if you want to take these children, or if you want to keep welfare from these families, you have to take the children, right after the federal government immediately starts funding the foster care system to make way for more states to take more children. So we have to question what was actually happening behind the scenes. But we're going to get into the Moynihan report. Before I do, I'm going to check and see if there are any questions. Peace, everyone. Any questions? Again, everyone, just give me a question mark, a bunch of question marks, or you can even at me directly, I think, although I don't know if I can see that in StreamYard. I know I could see that if I were on YouTube. Okay, so it looks like no one has any questions. We're all understanding essentially the reason why this all started was because a bunch of states wanted to keep us from accessing welfare. So because they wanted to keep us from accessing welfare, they were forced to make a choice. Are you going to leave the children with these families, or are you going to take the children? They said, let's take the children. So that's where it really began. And right after African children start becoming a major population in the child welfare system, the system immediately changes. The nature of the system, it becomes a punitive system. It goes from being a system that's about trying to save the children to basically trying to punish the parents. That's the immediate effects. And this is what happens, I would say, anytime you have Africans in mass become a part of any system, the system scrambles to make sure that it is hard on us, because they want to make sure that they're basically pressing down and ensuring that we don't gain power out of that system. Where are you on Fly Nubian Queen? Actually, yeah, Fly Nubian has been posting some of my videos, and so I think they do a couple days after. So yes, I was not there, and I was not there in person, but yes, they've been posting my videos, so I've been very grateful for that. Okay, so we're going to move into the Moynihan report. Now, I said earlier, beginning this conversation, drink some tea 1 second, that many of us in the African community use verbiage that was used against us to control us. We use it whenever we're talking about our problems. And that is probably one of my pet peeves. I've heard it many times. People say, all we have to do is essentially make sure that the Black family, as far as the Black fathers have to just stop leaving. And if that happens, then everything will be alleviated. We talk about the family structure, the woman's domineering, and all of these things. Now, of course, stereotypes are stereotypes for reasons, meaning if you have a stereotype of something, you've probably seen it happen. But the dangerous thing is to make wide assessments of our issues and do it in such a way that it's going to be institutionalized. And so essentially the system can create this narrative and create systems to back the narrative. And that's what happened with the child welfare system. This began with something called the Moynihan report. Daniel Patrick Moynihan, and in March of 1965, this was during the height of the civil rights movement. This is during the Johnson administration. And as I spoke about in a previous video, at that particular time where there's all of this protest going on, there are urban riots, people are burning down their cities, like they've never seen before. They're trying to figure out, what are we going to do to be able to get people to calm back down? That's the whole point of things like the Moynihan report. That's the bigger point, I would say, what's that big report that came out? The report, the Kerner Commission. That was the bigger part of the Kerner Commission. They want to find ways in the federal government. They try to find ways to pacify us. So they would create policies behind it. Now, Moynihan's report is the full name is The Negro Family, the Case for National Action. And it was inspired by an African, E. Franklin Fraser. He put out a message that the Black family has a pathology, and this pathology originated in slavery. I would say that's not true, but let's go through what the Moynihan report says. So Moynihan attributed high rates of poverty inside of African communities to what he called family disorganization, or families, he said, are disorganized. He said this prevented African children from undergoing the socialization which only the family can provide. I emphasize that only the family can provide because, as we've seen, this is a lot of the rhetoric that was utilized. If you remember earlier, I covered a man named Charles Loring Brace, whenever it came to the inception of child welfare being used as a way to assimilate children. So he says socialization is only provided through the family. He says Black people were not suffering in capitalism because of the system or the society. It's not the society's fault. Instead, it's because our parents are not properly raising our children. How many of you have heard us say things like this, not understanding where the source came from? He said the family structure, the African family structure, is a source of weakness to us, okay? And his conclusion was that the United States, essentially, to address these issues, has to bring Negro Americans to full and equal sharing in responsibilities and rewards of stewardship. But coded inside of this is essentially assimilation, the idea that you have to assimilate them into our culture in order for this family to not be defunct. Now, I said I don't agree with a lot of what he says, despite the fact that a lot of us use the same verbiage. I'll say one of the reasons why I don't agree. Number one, we should understand African fathers and African mothers. We need them both, right? I'm not someone who believes that that the father does not have a great role of importance. I believe having a father and a mother is very valuable. But I also know that where the father has not been there many times inside of African families, there's other male figures who have been there. So you might have an uncle, you might have a grandfather. And of course, the ultimate, the best thing would be to always have the father, but that's just not going to be the reality. Whenever you're a people who are being colonized, the system, as we see, takes a lot of our men, puts them inside a prison industrial complex, or causes disruption in our family structures, which causes a lot of families to break apart. So while we all understand that mothers and fathers are both needed, there is going to be situations where the mother might not be there and the father might not be there. The best way to address that is to have other people who have as much love for that child step in for that role. And I'm sure many of you have had people step in for that and into that role who have been a vital support for you being nurtured and groomed into this person who you are today. Unfortunately, in European society, they don't recognize that substitution parents, or they don't recognize kinship, extended family networks as being as efficient as the nuclear family. We spoke about this. The nuclear family, that is a European ideal. The idea that it's just mom, dad, children. Maybe grandma, but more so mom, dad, children, maybe grandma, grandpa on occasion. That is the family. That is what we consider the family. Anyone outside of that, we're not going to give the same weight. But I know for a fact many people who even might have had a parent, both parents, but yet an outside family member or an outside person in the community was able to even be a more reliable source of support than even their own biological parents. African people, we should understand we've adopted these customs because they've told us this is what is right, but we have to go back to our culture to understand that's just not what is true. In African culture, I went through that before. The mother and the father, there's been times, there's some cultures in Africa where the mother and the father are literally like, okay, this is our child, to the entire community, and the entire community raises the child. There's others, even some cultures where the mother and father basically allow the child to be raised by the grandparents or the elders of the community, and they basically see their child periodically. We should not adopt these narratives from the European system that mom, child, children, that is the system of parenting that we want to aspire to. So I don't believe that the family that we adopted got these things from slavery. Like, there's nothing Slavery is a significant trauma and damage to us. Let's not get that twisted. It caused an enormous stress to our families, but also we should understand African culture was very resilient even under slavery. So the idea that the fact that we don't necessarily rely on the nuclear family like European society does, that was not adopted by slavery, in my opinion. In my opinion, this is something that happens under stress of society. Whenever you're having a society continually oppressing and continually inflicting you, you're going to have family disturbance. No one is exempt from that. White society is not exempt from that. I made a point, I forget what show I was on, but I made a point recently. A lot of people want to talk about how single family, single parent homes is what destroys the Black community. But they don't talk about the fact that as of today, white families are basically neck and neck with us when it comes to single parent family homes. So if that was the only issue, why was the same circumstances not repeated inside of the European community in America? Why do they not have the same thing happening? Because they have power. That is our problem. We're powerless and we are subject to their will. So I would argue that even inside of a situation where our families are fractured, that if the same system let up from us, if we were able to control our own politics and have control over our own communities, that you would see the healing come naturally. A lot of what we're dealing with is just the result of decades and decades and decades of generational trauma from the system that has continually violated and inflicted violence on us. And it only gets worse over time when you're not allowed to heal, when you're not allowed to come back together. It only gets worse over time. So I hope I didn't spend too much time on that. I'm going to just very quickly check for questions again. Then we're going to get right into these laws. I'm going to try to go into these laws, particularly leading up to the era of the Bill Clinton administration. I'm going to try to go through those very quickly. Okay, I see a question from Brother Kanata. How are you? He says, Queen, have you ever been any financial literacy programs? Have there ever been any financial literacy programs tied to welfare? Not that I have heard of. If anyone knows of any, I have not heard of any, not at all. And let's see. Okay, I think those are only questions. So we're going to go through a bunch of laws really quickly because I want you to understand essentially what happens after African children are brought into the child welfare system. As I told you all, that significantly changed the nature of the system. It went from being a system that's about saving children to a system about punishing parents. So you're going to see why. Okay, so the first big law that comes out is the Child Abuse Prevention and Treatment Act. In a nutshell, this law passes anti-abuse policies and requires mandated reporting. Whenever you go into a hospital, if a doctor suspects that you use drugs or suspects that you might have neglected or abused your child, they're mandated reporters. Teachers are mandated reporters. Essentially, this criminalizes the child welfare system because no longer are these people, and I don't even trust the motives of these people who say if they're doing what they're doing out of charitable means, but now they're actually being armed with the law. You are ordered. If you see anything that looks like it could be abuse, neglect, you are ordered by the law to report it to authorities. So now you have people who are everyday professionals becoming an arm of the state. This is criminalizing of child welfare. That's a big thing that happens after we come into the child welfare system, right? Now, this leads to a lot of children going into foster care across the board. More disproportionately in the African community, but across the board among all races. And so there's a problem that comes with all this stress basically on the social welfare system. President Jimmy Carter did sign a law where he tried to lower the numbers of these children who are being brought into child welfare. It's called the Adoption Assistance in Child Welfare Act. Essentially, what the law did was try to put in place more services that were going to be preventative. So instead of just putting all the funds into basically, abuse reporting and making the professionals in our life more of a surveillance system, the laws basically goes into also allowing us to have more preventative care, more services, more programs. I'm trying to find some of the services. So for example, rehabilitation, family preservation, childcare, and counseling. And that's very efficient in some types of ways. I want to emphasize this law was very, very quickly it basically was gutted really quickly because President Reagan became president very soon after. But the very brief time that it was enacted, it did have a good effect. The foster care population saw a significant decrease from this law, shrinking by over 50%. from 500,000 to 243,000 between 1980 and 1982. That's very significant, right? I mean, shrinking by 50% within 2 years. I actually just remembered one thing that is important to remember about the previous law, the Child Abuse Prevention and Treatment Act, the one that essentially was the first one that was enacted after Africans come into the system, is that social workers also become basically an arm of the state, where they are now going to go in and investigate you, and they're going to go to the court and they're going to report on their investigation. So you can see more about this criminalization of child welfare services. So as I said, President Reagan comes in right after the AACWA was enacted. And essentially what he does is completely guts the law. Now, it's important to understand, before the law was enacted, that was also before a lot of catastrophic things that happened in our community. The HIV/AIDS epidemic, the crack epidemic, which caused obviously a lot of people to become homeless, a lot of people to basically struggle with drug abuse, which brought more violence into our communities. That had not happened yet. So the shrink in foster care did not account for that. But even with the small progress that President Reagan seen, he vowed that these programs would be gutted, and he basically slashed federal funds. So not long after being sworn in, he froze all recent regulations in an effort to reduce bureaucracy and shrink government, he said. Although he actually tried to repeal the law that Jimmy Carter put out, he was not able to, but he was, as I said, able to significantly decrease the funding. And he did so by eliminating performance-based funding. So before, states that were offering family prevention and rehabilitative service, if they were performing at a certain level, they would receive more funds. Instead of doing that, he instituted block grants where the funding was capped. You're only going to get this amount of money regardless of anything. Of course, this basically is unfortunate if you're trying to treat people and trying to help them so that you don't have to take their children, because the funding is capped. Reagan also lessened federal oversight, which allowed many states. And as I said, whenever you talk about states' rights, that leads to states where they're more aggressive against the Black family. That allows many states to focus on family intervention instead of prevention, meaning focus on having the state come in and take the children versus allowing the children to stay while you treat the parents. That became a big focus. Now, simultaneous to that, we have a lot of the rhetoric around the Black family coming out. Obviously, we've heard of things like welfare queens. We were basically utilized as a means to justify the United States shrinking the government. So they had to find some type of scapegoat. We were the scapegoat. It was like, we have to shrink government because we have all these people who are lazy, that are living off of welfare. We have these welfare queens. We have these pimps. We have all these people, women having a bunch of kids just so that they can have the money to continue. We have to do something. That was used basically as a tool to justify the government doing these things, as they were shrinking the funds available for prevention and putting focus instead on the interference and intervention to the African family. The effects were very, very felt inside of the African community. So by 1986, while we were only 15% of the population, we at that point made up 35% of the foster care population. And it's only going to go up in the 90s. But before we go to the 90s, I'm going to check and see if there's any questions. Whew, okay. Can we get a reference list of books at some point? If you mean books like things I'm citing, so again, this is the book Fostering False Identity. I cite everything in the back. But I'll give you just off the top of my head. Let me post the link to the book. Actually, I'll give you some books on the top of my head if you want to do some further reading. Books that I used when I was reading this. One is Children of the Storm. Another one, Dorothy Roberts. She wrote a book on child welfare. There's a book called Nobody's Children, which is written by a white woman who basically argues that transracial adoptions are great for us. She wrote a book called Nobody's Children, which I had to read for research purposes. The response book to that was there's a book called Somebody's Children. So that's another book. There's a lot of, books that talk about the foster care. I didn't read a lot that went into the history like I did as far as like Native American and the child saving movement, but a lot of them cover different aspects of the things I talk about. And obviously a Pan-Africanist person, so African woman. So I had a more so focus on the cultural aspects than a lot of the books that I read, but there is a pretty good amount of books. Just pulling up the link for everyone. If I can find it. Amazon's giving me problems, y'all, but I think the link is in the description of this video. I'm gonna look and see if there's any more questions. Does the nuclear family has created the need for interracial relationships in the community? Let me think about that. Does the nuclear family create the need for interracial relationships in the community? I don't personally see a link, but you know, if you see one, I'd be curious to know. I don't personally see a link. To me, what the nuclear family more so does is negate African practices, African family practices, and say that we have to have this formation. De facto, white people figure everything out, right? White people have the best when it comes to everything. So because of that, if they say this is the standard of what family is, then we're going to go to what they say and not go to what we see as being African culture. So that's what I would say is the focus, and it's another tool for the state to dominate and control our communities. I was able to find the link, so I just posted it in the chat as well. Okay, so don't think there's any more questions. Oh wait, one more or two more. Let me make this bigger for myself. Don't you think the agenda of pushing nuclear was more beneficial to Europeans due to the fact they have to build generational wealth? I think it was definitely more beneficial to the capitalist system, the individualized system. The idea that we're going to go in and occupy and control, and we're going to basically focus on ourselves and not our community. And these are ideals that are upheld in capitalism. If you're someone that's community minded, you're going to have a very hard time being the best capitalist you can be. So I do think the nuclear family definitely goes towards that. Because we should understand our African families, the reason why we rely on the communal family is because we don't have the same individualistic mindset that, oh, I have to get this on my own. It's more so if my community, my tribe, my nation is doing well, then that means I'm doing well. So I think it plays right into the hands of the capitalist system. What do you think is the most prosperous decade in the 20th century for Black people? I would not be the expert on that. I'm sure there's some other people who write a lot on these types of things. I know Dr. Ball writes about the idea of having, the Black dollar, stuff like that. So that's not something I would say is my expertise necessarily. All right, so we're going to wrap it up by talking about the 90s. This is something that we should emphasize because a lot of us are well aware of the fact that during the 90s, Bill Clinton had passed a lot of laws that targeted African people. Obviously, we know the crime bill and the welfare bill. We know these were direct attacks, but a lot of people do not talk about the fact that Bill Clinton also passed a number of laws specifically targeting us through the child welfare system. And this is something significantly looked over, I feel. So one thing that happens is the narratives change. The media changes, right? I said how the conservatives were utilizing us as a ploy to basically justify shrinking government. And so a lot of the narratives began to change as we go into this era. So you start hearing things like super predators. And this is not just said about Hillary Clinton. There's a whole book that I referenced that talks about us as super predators. We're depraved, we're criminals, we're crack babies, crack whores. Obviously, many of you, let me share my screen real quick. I'm sure many of you are aware of this particular film. So many of you, I'm sure, have seen Losing Isaiah. Let's just look closely at, if I can make this big, let's look closely at what this movie poster says. So You have the black woman. She's cradling a baby. Remember in the movie, he was a crack baby. He was left in a dumpster. The mom was a crack. I guess you say crack whore for lack of a better term. This is what they would say she was. She left the children there and basically went off. And I believe she's a prostitute, so she went off and left the baby in the trash. The baby was crying, and then he goes to the hospital, and this white woman sees him. She said, "Oh my gosh, I want to take care of you." And she takes him home, and she loves him and gives him everything he ever wanted. But unfortunately, his mom comes back into the picture clean, ready to take him, but he doesn't want his mom anymore, right? Understand it says right here, who decides what makes a mother? Implicating that she could be a better mother to her son than she can. Kind of the arrogance of the white supremacist system. You see in this image, the baby's cradling the white woman and doesn't want the black woman, right? These are a lot of the images that were going around back then, because again, this is still during the crack epidemic, and a lot of people have a lot of feelings about the African community. They have a lot of stereotypes going around about us. And so this is during that whole era. So I'm going to talk about some literature that came out during that time. There was one article that is called Children of Cocaine. This came out in 1989. I'm going to read from it. The inner city crack epidemic is now birthing to the newest horror. A biological underclass, a generation of physically damaged cocaine babies whose biological inferiority is stamped at birth. Yes, they said this. These are exaggerated claims that were said about what some people call crack babies, right? Something I didn't know until I started doing research for this book was that they were actually significantly overblowing this whole crack baby thing. And I know we've all heard it, like you might see kids rolling around that are just having issues, and people say, oh, that must have been a crack baby or something like that. First of all, I want us to understand that we shouldn't just adopt the narratives of the oppressor. So they told us that if your child was born with cocaine, and obviously we don't want any children to be born with cocaine. We're against drugs on this channel, and I'm sure all of you are. But if the baby is born with cocaine, that child was permanently damaged, and they're going to be damaged forever. This is what they told us, right? It was not true. Actually, the truth is that whenever you're exposed to cocaine in utero, yes, you will have delays when you're first born, usually. You usually have issues of child development. You'll have issues as far as trying to, basically adapt right from the womb, right? But it's actually been found that those issues, for the most part, actually level out as the child gets older. Specifically, the issues that you have from being exposed to cocaine in utero are similar to issues that you would experience being inside of a poor household. Meaning, let's say I'm a drug addicted mother. I give birth to a child while I was using crack, right? I have my child. You are a mother who was not doing drugs, but you live in a poor household where you have environmental pollutants. Maybe it's outside pollutants that are going in. Maybe you're eating bad foods. You're eating McDonald's. Maybe you're using products that are cheap, cleaning products that are cheap and that create chemicals that go throughout your house. The same issues that my child would have from being inside of my stomach and while I was doing crack versus your child, while they come out and they're exposed to all of these environmental pollutants, they would actually be about the same. This is what studies have shown. Actually, and another thing that I didn't know is that those effects that are experienced by children who are born from mothers who are using crack are actually less than what you would experience if that child was born while the mother was using tobacco or alcohol. And we know the funny thing about that, obviously, is that a lot of people smoke while they're pregnant or drink while it's not funny, but a lot of people smoke or drink while they're pregnant. And this goes across races, but they would never create this wide net as far as how white mothers and their children are going to be born. Just to quote again from the article, born a biological underclass, a generation of physically damaged babies whose biological inferiority is stamped at birth. They would never say that, despite the fact that it's been found that smoking while you're pregnant and drinking while you're pregnant long-term will have worse effects on your child than a child being born addicted to crack. Now, again, this is not to make light of the issue of children being addicted to crack. Please do not take anything if you are pregnant, if you do not have to, and even have to, question very much, who's telling you have to take certain things, please do not, because obviously your child is in the most delicate state when they were in your stomach. But we should not continue these narratives that the conservative media uses to allow for them to cast our women as being horrible, as in cast our children as being inferior. You understand, this goes back to the social anxiety that I was talking about. And think about it, if you're a white person, you're reading through the newspaper and you're hearing about this biological underclass of super predators that are coming out of the ghettos, you have anxiety. This is what it creates inside of the United States, a lot of social anxiety. And of course, as I spoke about previously, when you have this social anxiety, what happens is the state comes in to try to regulate those issues. And they did this with the African family. So let's talk about some of the things that were done. Now, this was a prequel to the laws coming into play. In 1994, Newt Gingrich, who was the Speaker of the House, the Republican Speaker of the House, he spoke about foster care as a way to address welfare reform. They were talking about the fact that they wanted to make cuts to welfare. And of course, the question comes, well, what are you going to do when you make cuts to welfare? And remember, welfare was originally mother's pensions. It was originally for white women. And it was a way to keep them home. Well, obviously, if you're cutting welfare, a lot of people who were able to take care of their children using that welfare, the question comes, what are going to happen to the children? Because they no longer have that financial way of being able to pay for childcare or pay for groceries or pay for these types of things. His answer was, young unwed mothers should be denied welfare, and if, as a result, they can't provide for their children, the children should be put in orphanages. He said this prior to the different laws that I'm going to talk about, from ASFA to the Multi-Ethnic Placement Act. He said this prior to that. He said this prior to the welfare laws being passed. So you can kind of see that this is already what they're planning. They're planning that they're going to make these significant cuts to welfare and to social network programs, and the answer is going to be what it was for Native American children, what it was for the European immigrant children. We're going to put them in a foster care because that is the best way to control this issue of super predators that are coming out of the ghettos, right? 1994, we know Bill Clinton signs the Violent Crime Control Act and Law Enforcement Act, better known as the crime bill, right? Now, while he's doing this, we should understand that not only is this affecting African men, this is a lot of fathers who are put inside of prison. Many of the people who are incarcerated are fathers, many of whom were a financial source to their families. Now you took the source of the man and put him in prison. That's an issue, but they go even further. In 1996, Bill Clinton signed the Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Reconciliation Act that drastically changed welfare, replacing it with TANF, Temporary Assistance for Needy Families. So we said that the source of income from the man is taken out, and now the state, which has been obligated prior to this to provide some assistance to poor families, now they're not there. African women left inside of a really isolated situation. What are they going to do now? Well, they're going to have to find ways to deal with this new problem of children. 1 second, please. All right, so let's go into some of the laws that came out. And I also want to set the stage. 46% of children in foster care were African at this point inside of the 90s. So it goes up from 35 to 46%. That's a huge amount. Again, we're about 15, maybe like under 15, between around that percent of the population. We don't really ever know our population because who knows, because of the Census Bureau. I don't trust their estimates, but about 15% of the population. 46% of us are in the foster care system. That's very, very drastically overrepresented, right? And we're going to see that the response from the government was, hey, we're going to have to use interracial, transracial adoptions. So the first law that comes out is the Multi-Ethnic Placement Act that was in 1994. This law barred caseworkers from considering race as the sole basis for denying a potential foster parent as an adoptive parent for a child. So if you recall, last week I talked about transracial adoption. The National Association of Black Social Workers in the 70s pushed to stop this idea that you should not have, that you should be able to place African children wherever you want to place them. You should have a preference for placing them with people with their own race. And at that time, the government did change and say, okay, if you can, do try to place the child in a home where they're going to be with people of their own race, so that they can be adopted if they are by someone of their own race. That was what they were basically forced to do in the Black Power movement, right? But now inside of the Clinton era, they reversed course. And this is one of his bills saying that you cannot consider the child, whether or not they're going to be inside of a white home or a Black home. You cannot consider their race. That cannot be a factor. And it became more ingrained inside in 1996 whenever they passed the interethnic adoption provision of the Small Business Job Protection Act. I actually want to emphasize the Small Business Protection Act obviously had nothing to do with interracial adoption, right? But it's something interesting for us to know. A lot of times they hide these provisions inside of laws, so a lot of us don't even know what's happening. So they'll have a law about consumer protection, and they'll put a provision inside of that law about, oh, do this when it comes to African people with their children, something that has nothing to do with the law. This is a way that they oftentimes hide things from us, which is why if you put your stock into the future of the United States government, you should definitely be focused on what they're passing in Washington. Now, the big one, though, that comes is, oh, wait, before I even get there, we have the Adoption Promotion and Stability Act in 1996. This was passed, and it made the Multi-Ethnic Placement Act a separate law. I want to read from a quote that Bill Clinton says, because the ironic thing when this law comes out is they're cutting funds in welfare. So they're cutting funds that would basically support African parents being able to keep their children. And at the same time, while they're cutting those funds as far as welfare, they're giving funds to middle-class families, trying to incentivize the middle-class families. And we know middle class is a code word for white affluent families, right? They're trying to incentivize them to adopt children transracially. So they said that if you do adopt a child, you will have a $5,000 per child tax credit. And Clinton said in regard to this that the tax credit would alleviate a primary barrier to adoption and enable middle-class families for whom adoption may be too expensive to adopt children. So again, here we are. It's about giving middle-class families, i.e. white families, the ability to adopt more children at the same time as we're sending many African children to foster care. But the nail in the coffin comes in 1994, the Adoption and Safe Families Act. If any of you have ever had a child who was put into foster care or have a family member, you might recall that essentially the second that child was in foster care, you were on a timeline. They said, okay, you got this long to get everything together and be able to have your child back in your home. Otherwise, we're going to be forced to terminate parental rights. This was a creation of ASFA. Now, this really changed it to being obviously more punitive because now they're actually putting a timetable. You have 1 year to get your act together. You have 15 out of 22 consecutive months, which comes down to about a little over a year. You have a little over a year to get your entire act together as a parent, to be made right, to be a good parent, despite the fact that you might have trauma, intergenerational trauma, drug use, different things that take longer than a year, all common sense would say, but you're going to have to be right by a year, despite the fact that you could be homeless just because you don't have any job. Like, you're trying to have a job, you're trying to get a way to take care of your kids, you're fighting for a way to be able to protect your family, but you're on that time clock. The timer is out. You have 1 year, or the state is going to be forced to file for termination of parental rights. So another thing that we should be aware when it comes to ASFA is that despite the law being called Adoption and Safe Families Act, we really don't know if the families, I would say they're not safer, just because what I know about how people will position themselves to quote unquote save children, but really they have no regard for those children. But in the end, we don't really know what happened to those children. That's the other thing. Essentially, once you're adopted, the state wipes their hands clean. They say, job well done. We did it. We got that child adopted, right? I spoke last week about what happened with Devontae Hart and his 5 siblings, Good job. We have a white couple, children with the white couple, wipe our hands clean. Good job. We did it, right? No one's going to go back and check in on those children. Those children were being significantly abused. Those children were being starved many times. And eventually the adopted parents killed those children. No one was checking in on them. Even whenever there were abuse allegations, the state gave those parents the benefit of the doubt. We don't know what happens to children once they're adopted. So that's something that's should be emphasized. We don't know what happens to them. We don't know what trauma they're going through. We don't know what type of abuse they could be affected by. And if they were really serious about being called the Adoption and Safe Families Act, you would think they have a mechanism to actually track that. Another thing I want to talk about, though, is something called legal orphans. So it is the case that you will have your parental rights terminated, right? You're by the states to the state. You are no longer that child's parent, meaning you don't have any rights if your parental rights are terminated. You don't have a right where that child what that child eats, sleeps, what they wear. You don't have a right to where they go to school. You don't have a right to what types of things they're exposed to. You have no rights over your child if your parental rights are terminated. The problem is, though, if your child does not get adopted right away, and almost no kids get adopted right away, and more so, if your parental rights are terminated and your child does not ever get adopted, which does happen disproportionately to African children, because there's a lot of problems, obviously, that we are passing down whenever we're not able to heal ourselves. And sometimes children become quote unquote problem children. What happens many times is that those children become what we call legal orphans. So no one adopted them, and their parents are no longer their parents, according to the state. And the state obviously will to try to keep that child separate from their parents. This happens very, very often. Just to read from some statistics, in 2016, there were 117,000 children who had their parental rights have been terminated, yet 65,000 of whom were not adopted. So that's a significant amount. In addition, only about 13% of children, whenever they're actually put into foster homes, those foster homes even become their adopted placements, meaning a lot of times they will terminate your parental rights without even having a home for your child that's committed to adopting your child. So your child becomes a legal orphan, and that child doesn't have anywhere to go. They don't have any family to go to. They don't have anything. This is what the state does. And despite the fact they know that this happens, they don't care. They're continuing this policy that was put into place after ASFA. So I'm going to stop right there. We're just going to take some questions. If you have any questions. Oh, okay. I see some at Attorney Cherise. I'm sorry, y'all. I wasn't even seeing that. Okay, so at African Esquire, it says, the crime bill was bipartisan with people like Giuliani and Chuck Schumer working hand in hand. Point is, Democrats, Republicans are all, just trust me. If you watch this channel, you know that we know that Democrats and Republicans are all the same. But I will say this, that I prefer people who are like not afraid, or not even not afraid, who are not going to pretend like they're my friend and then turn out to be my enemy. I mean, that's what Malcolm X told us repeatedly. I prefer a wolf than a fox that's going to pretend that he's my friend and then turn on me immediately. I feel the same. And so when it comes to the Democrats, like I put more focus on them whenever they make these decisions, because they parade like they're our friends. And we should know by now that they're not, but some of us are like in denial. Some of us have Stockholm syndrome. Like, we just want these people who have oppressed us and done so many things to us. We want them to be our saviors still. So yes, I put more emphasis whenever it's Democrats doing it, just because of the fact that they pretend to be our friends, and we have to out them. You are just as bad as the Republicans, because you are both a part of the white supremacist system, and that is what it is. Okay, let's see. At Tierney Cherie, how do you think our world would be different if money was given to the homes in our community? So we're going to talk about solutions definitely next week, and we're doing it next week on Thursday. I usually do Fridays, but I have to do Thursday this week. One, I think that we should also scrutinize the government when they say they're helping us. And of course, their ultimate way of trying to help us is, how do we help these people enough to not give them power, but to still control their politics, you know? So even whenever like welfare was given, it was still very much connected to the bureaucracy, and they were still monitoring us and still using it as a way to basically have a surveillance system in our communities, and not to let us gain power. That was always the goal. Do not let these people gain power. So I think that absolutely the idea that we should not have some type of assistance, I mean, that just puts parents inside of more of a position where their children are more easily taken, because if I don't have a child care voucher, who's going to take care of my kids? I have to work. So therefore the state comes in and take my child. That's a horrible situation. Happens many times. So we do need services. I argue, and I'll go into details next week, that we have to control our services. The government, we should know by now, does owe Africans in America much payback, you know, for slavery, and not just slavery, for oppression, for Jim Crow, for redlining, for all of those things. And rather than giving us some surface level funds in order to keep us going inside of the same position, I think we should demand funds to control our own homes, control our own communities. To me, that's the ultimate solution. So we'll go more into that next week for sure. Audio book lists. I drive. Oh, I don't have an audiobook list, and I've heard many times people tell me to put this on audiobook. I'm sorry, I haven't. Yeah, I would have to sit down and read through the whole thing because I don't got money like that to pay someone to do it. But yes, I don't have that as of yet. But I did go through the entire book for that purpose because I understand some people kind of just want the information quickly. So maybe if you watch all the videos that I did, it's inside of the playlist on my channel, Fostering False Identity. And I went through every chapter. Maybe that would be a reference if there's something key that I talk about that you want to do more research on. You could go into the actual chapter and do some more investigating. That's probably a good substitute as of now. The tea must be delicious. I am addicted to tea. I don't know why. Like every time I do a video, if I don't have tea, I feel like I'm lost. So yes. And more so than delicious, y'all. It's kind of cold out here. So we gotta make sure that we are drinking something. All right, so let's see. What do you see the government implementing in the present time into the welfare system against the community to keep us under their control? Welfare has been very significantly decreased in modern times. And it's essentially a way, like I said, to give us as little as possible without being outwardly barbaric, because you don't want to see all these people starving. I think it's very significant when we saw white America in trouble during the COVID-19 pandemic that all of a sudden this welfare that was going to be used to not make us dependent, all of a sudden this government opens the floodgates and gives all of these Caucasians and they have to give us money, so they all of a sudden are charitable. They can't just give white people money. All of a sudden when white people are in need, all of a sudden welfare is fine. So as far as what do they do to control us, I think that their ultimate way of controlling us is certainly the prison industrial complex, and certainly putting us inside of these child welfare courts where we have to go through hoops and basically bow to these judges. I mean, think about it. Judges are people, y'all. They are people. They are like us, and they put people like us over our families, and they get to decide what happens to your family. I think that's what the state does as far as regulating us tightly. At this particular time, they've not used funding as a way to do it, only to a certain degree, because they don't want to basically be seen as the ones that allowed everyone to starve, of course. Let's see. Yes, it's an inexpensive book. I made it as cheaply as possible because I did have to pay off some of the services I used to get the book. But yes, inexpensive book. And I'll post it again for anyone who wants it. Let's see, going through for some more questions. So someone, okay, better future. So does that mean our problems can only be solved if it is aligned with white people's issues? Our problems won't be solved. You'll only get concessions, I think, whenever we are grouped with, well, yeah, let me rephrase that. Yes, you'll get confessions when white America is in jeopardy, and yes, you will see the government act different towards us whenever we're grouped in with white people necessarily. I think that's what you've seen in the COVID-19 pandemic. Trust me, if the pandemic was only in the hood, we would not have gotten all these relief funds and all those things like that. Oh, okay. So as we stand, we don't have the power to stop the government from taking what they want from us. Do you think otherwise? This is a crucial question for many of us African people, is what do we do? And we're going to go into some solutions that I propose. Let me be very clear with y'all. And I've said this a number of times on this channel. Some of you don't feel this way, and I respect the way that you feel, because realistically, we have been here for generations and we have ties to this country. But I personally do not feel that there's going to be a day with this government and system intact, meaning the government running as it does, where they're not going to have that control over us. I think that the system would literally have to be dissolved, and I don't know what it would take to do that. So because of that, I am definitely more of a fan, not of running away to Africa, because Africa has its own problems. Let me emphasize that. If you go into Africa, you're going to have different problems. All my brothers and sisters who've been to Africa, I know you know this for yourselves. There are issues there. We're colonized everywhere. But the only difference that I feel is that the fight for sovereignty and land, you know, we're fighting for your homeland. You're fighting for your land. Now you can fight for land here, and there's a lot of people who've taken that position, fighting for land here. And I think the closer you are to white supremacy, the more that white supremacy clamps down on you. So for example, we've seen many times in the past where African people did own land, and then what happens is that white society decides, we want this land for ourselves, so let's seize the land. That's something that's very prominent. So just me personally, I don't feel like power is going to be achieved within these borders. But if you do, I'm going to talk about some solutions. If for what I see, if you're going to achieve power in the United States as an African people, these are some things that I would argue are the most essential. So we'll go into that next week. Okay. Trying to make sure I get everyone's questions before we stop. So scrolling through. Let's see. This kind of goes to the last question. Do you think anytime soon we will actually separate from these people? Will we actually separate from the United States? Well, we're going to go into that again next week, because sovereignty is a tricky, it's a legal argument. It's a political argument. I don't think anytime soon, because I don't see any movement of people in an organized fashion. I see movements or organizations. I see people. I see voices and people who have been trying to wake people up, but I don't see the masses following. And that's the type of thing that you would need popular support from the community. So in all honesty, I don't see that happening. What kind of tea are you drinking? I drink green tea with lemon. And if I'm lucky, I have ginger. I'm gonna have ginger in it because I need something for this cold weather. Okay, let's see. Anything else? I think this is the last question I'll cover. It says, the way the collective is moving towards integration, is it wise for the minority to fight a collective of people who don't even want to see a separate community? Yeah, I mean, you basically be fighting for, think about it. If we were like real serious, like, okay, we're going to do this, we're going to separate, blah, blah, blah. We've been fighting against ourselves. It's probably, I'll say it's probably like 5% of us that really feel that way. Let's be honest, like most of us don't feel that way. So let's say, and be gracious and say 5%. And even that's being gracious, 5% of us will have to fight 95% of us that want in the system or just don't have fight in them to fight the system. We would have to be fighting each other. So again, that's why I say, in all honesty, like I personally don't see that as being the best route to sovereignty and power. And I think if you're here, I hope you all want sovereignty and power and not, just to be a second-class citizen. But, at the same time, I do think it's important that we give room for people and say that there are arguments for people to stay in our communities and find ways to organize. But the question is, will that lead to sovereignty? That's, to me, the ultimate question. I don't necessarily see that happening, but I would be so happy if that were the case. So, like I said, we'll talk about this more next week. I'll try not to be a downer next week because I know not everyone feels the same I do when it comes to the whole, okay, let's repatriate thing. And I understand, because it's a real decision. Like, anyone who's ever been to the continent knows it's not like this rosy thing that a lot of people try to make it seem like you're just going to go and people going to be playing drums and you're going to get the welcome. Like, people will be very kind to you. You'll be among kin, you'll have some very, good experiences. But the problem is that our countries, our continent is under control. So a lot of things that you might be easily accustomed to, being in the West, and don't be comfortable in the West. Let me say that, because we are in the belly of the beast. But a lot of things that you might be comfortable with being in the West are not necessarily going to be there, like something like the water might not be on all the time. The government might have to turn it off periodically. So, you might want to start thinking about digging a well, things like that, like, or something like the roads, you know, the roads could be jacked up and your car could, you know, suffer, you know, these are things we're accustomed to. So it just, I don't want to paint a rosy picture of going to the continent, but to me, the reason why I push that as being, for me, like the ultimate is because I don't think there's going to be sovereignty in the United States, given the current landscape. You know, I think there were times and opportunities where we could have probably pushed that most efficiently. Just in this current landscape, I don't personally see it happening. So I will not be a downer next week, I promise. I'm going to be very methodological. Oh, did I make that word up? I'm going to really try to go through and just, you know, talk about some of the arguments that we should be using if we do plan on staying here. And if you don't plan on staying here, let's just talk about, you know, what's the plan, because we have the revolutionary repatriation class that Frank is going to be lecturing, and the focus on that class again is, okay, we're not going to be staying in America. We're going to go fight for the sovereignty of our land, but how do you do so in a way that doesn't contribute to the system, but is revolutionary in fighting the system? So that will be something that happens whenever Frank comes on. So everyone, with that, I think we are good. Next week is the last chapter, chapter 8. We're going to go into, like I said, what are the solutions? What are the possible solutions? What does sovereignty mean? How do we control the politics of our communities in a way that controls our own child welfare system? We're going to be exploring that topic, and hopefully, well, you know, give some people some ideas, because this is not going to change, folks, until we get serious about it. And I think there's potential definitely to at least pass some laws that give us basic protections. So don't let my pessimism for sovereignty in America derail us from, you know, still raising our voice and organizing to change the laws, because there are some basic laws that I think would have an immediate effect. Something like what Native Americans have passed, where the caseworkers, they have to have probable cause before they can remove your child, rather than just having a reasonable suspicion that you committed abuse on your child. That's something very basic that can really change and help us getting more services, mandating more services. These are all things that should definitely that could definitely help us. So we're going to go into that next week, same time, 8 a.m. on Thursday. And until then, I will see you guys in the next broadcast.